Hello, thank you for joining me and welcome to A People's Historian. My name is Jason Kishinev. Each episode will read for about 30 minutes from a history book. A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn is what I have. At some point we'll move on to other history books. Howard Zinn was a unique historian. Most history books were teaching history from the perspective of nations and from leaders. Howard Zinn wanted to tell history from the perspective of movements and from people. And I found that really inspiring. I learned a lot from Howard Zinn. So I'm going to start with the World War II era because I feel like there's a lot of tidbits in here that are really relevant today. So let's just get started. We're at chapter 16, A People's War, with the question mark. So, A People's War. We, the governments of Great Britain and the United States, in the name of India, Burma, Malaya, Australia, British East Africa, British Guiana, Hong Kong, Siam, Singapore, Egypt, Palestine, Canada, New Zealand, Northern Ireland, Scotland, Wales, as well as Puerto Rico, Guam, the Philippines, Hawaii, Alaska, and the Virgin Islands, hereby declare most emphatically that this is not an imperialist war. Thus went a skit put on in the United States in the year 1939 by the Communist Party. 2 years later, Germany invaded Soviet Russia, and the American Communist Party, which had repeatedly described the war between the Axis powers and the Allied powers as an imperialist war, now called it a people's war against fascism. Indeed, almost all Americans were now in agreement, capitalists, communists, Democrats, Republicans, poor, rich, and the middle class, that this was indeed a people's war. Was it? By certain evidence, it was the most popular war the United States had ever fought. Never had a greater proportion of the country participated in a war. 18 million served in the armed forces, 10 million overseas. 25 million workers gave of their pay envelope regularly for war bonds. But could this be considered a manufactured support, since all the power of the nation, not only of the government, but the press, the church, and even the chief radical organizations, was behind the calls for all-out war? Was there an undercurrent of reluctance? Were there unpublicized signs of resistance? It was a war against an enemy of unspeakable evil. Hitler's Germany was extending totalitarianism, racism, militarism, and overt aggressive warfare beyond what an already cynical world had experienced. And yet did the governments conducting this war, England, the United States, the Soviet Union, represent something significantly different, so that their victory would be a blow to imperialism, racism, totalitarianism, militarism in the world? Would the behavior of the United States during the war, in military actions abroad, in treatment of minorities at home, be in keeping with a people's war? Would the country's wartime policies respect the rights of ordinary people everywhere to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? And would post-war America, in its policies at home and overseas, exemplify the values for which the war was supposed to have been fought? These questions deserve thought. At the time of World War II, the atmosphere was too dense with war fervor to permit them to be aired. For the United States to step forward as a defender of helpless countries matched its image in American high school history textbooks, but not its record in world affairs. It had opposed the Haitian Revolution for independence from France at the start of the 19th century. It had instigated a war with Mexico and taken half the country. It had pretended to help Cuba win freedom from Spain and then planted itself in Cuba with a military base, investments, and rights of intervention. It had seized Hawaii, Puerto Rico, Guam, and fought a brutal war to subjugate the Filipinos. It had opened Japan to its trade with gunboats and threats. It had declared an open-door policy in China as a means of assuring that the United States would have opportunities equal to other imperial powers in exploiting China. It had sent troops to Peking with other nations to assert Western supremacy in China and kept them there for over 30 years. While demanding an open door in China, it had insisted, with the Monroe Doctrine and many military interventions, on a closed door in Latin America. That is, closed to everyone but the United States. It had engineered a revolution against Colombia and created the independent state of Panama in order to build and control the canal. It sent 5,000 Marines to Nicaragua in 1926 to counter a revolution and kept a force there for 7 years. It intervened in the Dominican Republic for the 4th time in 1916 and kept troops there for 8 years. It intervened for the 2nd time in Haiti in 1915 and kept troops there for 19 years. Between 1900 and 1933, the United States intervened in Cuba 4 times, in Nicaragua twice, in Panama 6 times, in Guatemala once, in Honduras 7 times. By 1924, the finances of half of the 20 Latin American states were being directed to some extent by the United States. By 1935, over half of U.S. steel and cotton exports were being sold in Latin America. Just before World War I ended in 1918, an American force of 7,000 landed at Vladivostok as part of an Allied intervention in Russia and remained until early 1920. 5,000 more troops were landed at Archangel, another Russian port, also as part of an Allied expeditionary force, and stayed for almost a year. The State Department told Congress all these operations were to offset effects of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. In short, if the entrance of the United States into World War II was, as so many Americans believed at that time, observing the Nazi invasions to defend the principle of non-intervention in the affairs of other countries, the nation's record cast doubt on its ability to uphold that principle. What seemed clear at the time was that the United States was a democracy, with certain liberties, while Germany was a dictatorship, persecuting its Jewish minority, imprisoning dissidents, whatever their religion, while proclaiming the supremacy of the Nordic race. However, blacks, looking at anti-Semitism in Germany, might not see their own situation in the U.S. as much different. And the United States had done little about Hitler's policies of persecution. Indeed, it had joined England and France in appeasing Hitler throughout the 30s. Roosevelt and his Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, were hesitant to criticize publicly Hitler's anti-Semitic policies when a resolution was introduced in the Senate in January 1934 asking the Senate and the President to express surprise and pain at what the Germans were doing to the Jews and to ask restoration of Jewish rights. The State Department caused this resolution to be buried in committee, according to Arnold Offner. When Mussolini's Italy invaded Ethiopia in 1935, the U.S. declared an embargo on munitions, but let American businesses send oil to Italy in huge quantities, which was essential to Italy's carrying on the war. When a fascist rebellion took place in Spain in 1936 against the elected socialist liberal government, the Roosevelt administration sponsored a Neutrality Act that had the effect of shutting off help to the Spanish government, while Hitler and Mussolini gave critical aid to Franco. Offner says, the United States went beyond even the legal requirements of its neutrality legislation. Had aid been forthcoming from the United States and from England and France, considering that Hitler's position on aid to Franco was not firm at least until November 1936, the Spanish Republicans could well have triumphed. Instead, Germany gained every advantage from the Spanish Civil War. Was this simply poor judgment, an unfortunate error? Or was it the logical policy of a government whose main interest was not stopping fascism, but advancing the imperial interests of the United States? For those interests in the 30s, an anti-Soviet policy seemed best. Later, when Japan and Germany threatened U.S. world interests, a pro-Soviet, anti-Nazi policy became preferable. Roosevelt was as much concerned to end the oppression of Jews as Lincoln was to end slavery during the Civil War. And we'll cover that in another episode, of course. Their priority in policy, whatever their personal compassion for victims of persecution, was not minority right, but national power. It was not Hitler's attacks on the Jews that brought the United States into World War II, any more than the enslavement of 4 million blacks brought civil war in 1861. Italy's attack on Ethiopia, Hitler's invasion of Austria, his takeover of Czechoslovakia, his attack on Poland. None of those events caused the United States to enter the war, although Roosevelt did begin to give important aid to England. What brought the United States fully into the war was the Japanese attack on the American naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, on December 7, 1941. Surely it was not the humane concern for Japan's bombing of civilians that led to Roosevelt's outraged call for war. Japan's attack on China in 1937, her bombing of civilians at Nanking, had not provoked the United States to war. It was the Japanese attack on a link in the American Pacific Empire that did it. So long as Japan remained a well-behaved member of that imperial club of great powers who, in keeping with the open door policy, were sharing the exploitation of China, the United States did not object. It had exchanged notes with Japan in 1917, saying, "The government of the United States recognizes that Japan has special interests in China." In 1928, according to Akira Irie, American consuls in China supported the coming of Japanese troops. It was when Japan threatened potential U.S. markets by its attempted takeover of China, but especially as it moved toward the tin, rubber, and oil of Southeast Asia, that the United States became alarmed and took those measures which led to the Japanese attack: a total embargo on scrap iron, a total embargo on oil in the summer of 1941. As Bruce Russett says, throughout the 1930s, the United States government had done little to resist the Japanese advance on the Asian continent. But the Southwest Pacific area was of undeniable economic importance to the United States. At the time, most of America's tin and rubber came from there, as did substantial quantities of other raw materials. Pearl Harbor was presented to the American public as a sudden, shocking, immoral act. Immoral it was, like any bombing, but not really sudden or shocking to the American government. Russett says, Japan's strike against the American Navy base climaxed a long series of mutually antagonistic acts. In initiating economic sanctions against Japan, the United States undertook actions that were widely recognized in Washington as carrying grave risks of war. Putting aside the wild accusations against Roosevelt that he knew about Pearl Harbor and didn't tell, or that he deliberately provoked the Pearl Harbor raid, these are without evidence. It does seem clear that he did as James Polk had done before him in the Mexican War, and Lyndon Johnson after him in the Vietnam War. He lied to the public for what he thought was a right cause. In September and October 1941, he misstated the facts in 2 incidents involving German submarines and American destroyers. A historian sympathetic to Roosevelt, Thomas A. Bailey, had written, Franklin Roosevelt repeatedly deceived the American people during the period before Pearl Harbor. He was like the physician who must tell the patient lies for the patient's own good, because the masses are notoriously short-sighted and generally cannot see danger until it is at their throats. One of the judges in the Tokyo war crimes trial after World War II, Radhabinod Pal, dissented from the general verdicts against Japanese officials and argued that the United States had clearly provoked the war with Japan and expected Japan to act. Richard Minier sums up Pal's view of the embargoes on scrap iron and oil, that these measures were a clear and potent threat to Japan's very existence. The records show that a White House conference 2 weeks before Pearl Harbor anticipated a war and discussed how it should be justified. Let me read that again. The records show that a White House conference 2 weeks before Pearl Harbor anticipated a war and discussed how it should be justified. A State Department memorandum on Japanese expansion a year before Pearl Harbor did not talk of the independence of China or the principle of self-determination. It said, "Our general diplomatic and strategic position would be considerably weakened by our loss of Chinese, Indian, and South Seas markets, and by our loss of much of the Japanese market for our goods, as Japan would become more and more self-sufficient, as well as by insurmountable restrictions upon our access to the rubber, tin, jute, and other vital materials of the Asian and Oceanic regions. Once joined with England and Russia in the war, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States right after Pearl Harbor. Did the behavior of the United States show that her aims were humanitarian or centered on power and profit? Was she fighting the war to end the control by some nations over others, or to make sure the controlling nations were friends of the United States? In August 1941, Roosevelt and Churchill met off the coast of Newfoundland and released to the world the Atlantic Charter, setting forth noble goals for the post-war world, saying the countries seek no aggrandizement, territorial or other, and that they respected the rights of all peoples to choose the form of government under which they live. The Charter was celebrated as declaring the right of nations to self-determination. 2 weeks before the Atlantic Charter, however, the U.S. Acting Secretary of State, Sumner Welles, had assured the French government that they could keep their empire intact after the end of the war. This government, mindful of its traditional friendship for France, has deeply sympathized with the desire of the French people to maintain their territories and to preserve them intact. The Department of Defense History of Vietnam itself pointed out what it called an ambivalent policy towards Indochina, noting that in the Atlantic Charter and other pronouncements, the U.S. proclaimed support for national determination and independence, but also early in the war repeatedly expressed or implied to the French an intention to restore to France its overseas empire after the war. In late 1942, Roosevelt's personal representative assured French General Henri Giraud, "It is thoroughly understood that French sovereignty will be re-established as soon as possible throughout all the territory, metropolitan or colonial, over which flew the French flag in 1939. These pages, like the others in the Pentagon Papers, are marked top secret, sensitive. By 1945, the ambivalent attitude was gone. In May, Truman assured the French he did not question her sovereignty over Indochina. That fall, the United States urged nationalist China, put temporarily in charge of the northern part of Indochina by the Potsdam Conference, to turn it over to the French, despite the obvious desire of the Vietnamese for independence. That was a favor for the French government. But what about the United States' own imperial ambitions during the war? What about the aggrandizement, territorial or other, that Roosevelt had renounced in the Atlantic Charter? In the headlines were the battles and troop movements, the invasion of North Africa in 1942, Italy in 1943, the massive dramatic cross-channel invasion of German-occupied France in 1944, the bitter battles as Germany was pushed back toward and over her frontiers, the increasing bombardment by the British and American air forces, and at the same time the Russian victories over the Nazi armies. The Russians, by the time of the cross-channel invasion, had driven the Germans out of Russia and were engaging 80% of the German troops. In the Pacific in 1943 and 1944, there was the island-by-island move of American forces toward Japan, finding closer and closer bases for the thunderous bombardment of Japanese cities. Quietly behind the headlines in battles and bombings, American diplomats and businessmen worked hard to make sure that when the war ended, American economic power would be second to none in the world. United States business would penetrate areas that up to this time had been dominated by England. The open door policy of equal access would be extended from Asia to Europe, meaning that the United States intended to push England aside and move in. That is what happened to the Middle East and its oil. In August 1945, a State Department officer said that a review of the diplomatic history of the past 35 years will show that petroleum has historically played a larger part in the external relations of the United States than any other commodity. Saudi Arabia was the largest oil pool in the Middle East. The Aramco Oil Corporation, through Secretary of the Interior Harold Ickes, got Roosevelt to agree to lend lease aid to Saudi Arabia, which would involve the U.S. government there and create a shield for the interests of Aramco. In 1944, Britain and the U.S. signed a pact on oil, agreeing on the principle of equal opportunity. And Lloyd Gardner concludes that the open door policy was triumphant throughout the Middle East. Historian Gabriel Kolko, after a close study of American wartime policy, concludes that the American economic war aim was to save capitalism at home and abroad. In April 1944, a State Department official said, "As you know, we've got to plan on enormously increased production in this country after the war, and the American domestic market can't absorb all that production indefinitely. There won't be any question about our needing greatly increased foreign markets." Anthony Sampson, in his study of the international oil business, says, "By the end of the war, the dominant influence in Saudi Arabia was unquestionably the United States. King Ibn Saud was regarded no longer as a wild desert warrior, but as a key piece in the power game, to be wooed by the West. Roosevelt, on his way back from Yalta in February 1945, entertained the king on the cruiser Quincy, together with his entourage of 50, including 2 sons, a prime minister, an astrologer, and flocks of sheep for slaughter." Roosevelt then wrote to Ibn Saud, promising the United States would not change its Palestine policy without consulting the Arabs. In later years, the concern for oil would constantly compete with political concern for the Jewish state in the Middle East, but at this point, oil seemed more important. With British imperial power collapsing during World War II, the United States was ready to move in. Hull said early in the war, "Leadership toward a new system of international relationships in trade and other economic affairs will devolve very largely upon the United States because of our great economic strength. We should assume this leadership and the responsibility that goes with it, primarily for reasons of pure national self-interest." Before the war was over, the administration was planning the outlines of the new international economic order based on partnership between government and big business. Lloyd Gardner says of Roosevelt's chief advisor, Harry Hopkins, who had organized the relief programs of the New Deal, no conservative outdid Hopkins in championing foreign investment and its protection. The poet, Archibald MacLeish, then an assistant secretary of state, spoke critically of what he saw in the post-war world. As things are now going, the peace we will make, the peace we seem to be making, will be a piece of oil, a piece of gold, a piece of shipping, a peace, in brief, without moral purpose or human interest. During the war, England and the United States set up the International Monetary Fund to regulate international exchanges of currency. Voting would be proportional to capital contributed, so American dominance would be assured. The International Bank for Reconstruction and Development was set up, supposedly to help reconstruct war-destroyed areas, but one of its first objectives was, in its own words, to promote foreign investment. The economic aid countries would need after the war was already seen in political terms. Averell Harriman, ambassador to Russia, said in early 1944, "Economic assistance is one of the most effective weapons at our disposal to influence European political events in the direction we desire." The creation of the United Nations during the war was presented to the world as international cooperation to prevent future wars, but the UN was dominated by the Western imperial countries, the United States, England, and France, and a new imperial power with military bases and powerful influence in Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union. An important conservative Republican senator, Arthur Vandenberg, wrote in his diary about the United Nations Charter, "The striking thing about it is that it is so conservative from a nationalist standpoint. It is based virtually on a four-point power alliance. This is anything but a wild-eyed internationalist dream of world state. I am deeply impressed and surprised to find Hall so carefully guarding our American veto in his scheme of things." The plight of Jews in German-occupied Europe, which many people thought was at the heart of the war against the Axis, was not a chief concern of Roosevelt. Harry Feingold's research shows that while the Jews were being put in camps and the process of annihilation was beginning that would end in the horrifying extermination of 6 million Jews and millions of non-Jews, Roosevelt failed to take steps that might have saved thousands of lives. He did not see it as a high priority. He left it to the State Department. And in the State Department, anti-Semitism and a cold bureaucracy became obstacles to action. Was the war being fought to establish that Hitler was wrong in his ideas of white Nordic supremacy over inferior races? The United States Armed Forces were segregated by race. When troops were jammed onto the Queen Mary in early 1945 to go to combat duty in the European theater, the blacks were stowed down in the depths of the ship near the engine room, as far as possible from the fresh air of the deck, in a bizarre reminder of the slave voyages of old. The Red Cross, with government approval, separated the blood donations of blacks and whites. It was ironically a black physician named Charles Drew who developed the blood bank system. He was put in charge of the wartime donations, and then fired when he tried to end blood segregation. Despite the urgent need for wartime labor, blacks were still being discriminated against for jobs. A spokesman for a West Coast aviation plant said, "The Negro will be considered only as janitors and in other similar capacities. Regardless of their training as aircraft workers, we will not employ them." Roosevelt never did anything to enforce the orders of the Fair Employment Practices Commission that he had set up. The fascist nations were notorious in their insistence that the woman's place was in the home. Yet the war against fascism, although it utilized women in defense industries where they were desperately needed, took no special steps to change the subordinate role of women. The War Manpower Commission, despite the large numbers of women in war work, kept women off its policy-making bodies. A report of the Women's Bureau of the Department of Labor by its director, Mary Anderson, said the War Manpower Commission had doubts and uneasiness about what was then regarded as a developing attitude of militancy or a crusading spirit on the part of women leaders. In one of its policies, the United States came close to direct duplication of fascism. This was in its treatment of the Japanese Americans living on the West Coast. After the Pearl Harbor attack, anti-Japanese hysteria spread in the government. One congressman said, "I'm for catching every Japanese in America, Alaska, and Hawaii now, and putting them in concentration camps. Damn them! Let's get rid of them!" Franklin D. Roosevelt did not share this frenzy, but he calmly signed Executive Order 9066 in February 1942, giving the Army the power, without warrants or indictments or hearings, to arrest every Japanese American on the West Coast. 110,000 men, women, and children, to take them from their homes, transport them to camps far into the interior, and keep them there under prison conditions. 3/4 of these were Nisei, children born in the United States of Japanese parents and therefore American citizens. The other fourth, the Issei, born in Japan, were barred by law from becoming citizens. In 1944, the Supreme Court upheld the forced evacuation on the grounds of military necessity. The Japanese remained in those camps for over 3 years. Michi Weglin was a young girl when her family experienced evacuation and detention. She tells of bungling in the evacuation, of misery, confusion, anger, but also of Japanese American dignity and fighting back. There were strikes, petitions, mass meetings, refusal to sign loyalty oaths, riots against the camp authorities. The Japanese resisted to the end. Not until after the war did the story of the Japanese Americans begin to be known to the general public. The month the war ended in Asia, September 1945, an article appeared in Harper's Magazine by Yale law professor Eugene V. Rostow, calling the Japanese evacuation our worst wartime mistake. Was it a mistake, or was it an action to be expected from a nation with a long history of racism and which was fighting a war not to end racism but to retain the fundamental elements of the American system? And I'm going to end there. So I hope you enjoyed the reading. Please hit the like button, the subscribe button, and that notification bell up top, because YouTube has been known to unsubscribe viewers. Appreciate it, and we'll see you next time. Thank you very much.